Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn crept over the village like a whispered prayer, its light soft as a sigh, slipping through the mist to brush the rice fields that bowed beyond the dike. Diep stood by a weathered gate, her hands clutching a bamboo basket, its strands frayed as her heart. The air was heavy with dew and wood smoke, laced with the cluck of chickens and the faint rush of a stream winding through the hills. Hockey, her small dog, pressed against her leg, his frame thin but warm, his eyes sharp with hunger, but even his nudge couldn't still the storm in her chest. Hours ago, Tuan had sat across from her in a dim cafe, his voice low, his words a blade. "You're not my sister, Diep. She's not your mother." The truth had shattered her, a life built on hope now dust, and as the village stirred, she wondered if love, James's hers, could mend what broke. She stepped onto the path, her sandals sinking into the earth, each footfall a thread to a past she'd thought was hers. The village was a patchwork of memory, palm roofs glinting under the sun, a market where voices haggled over greens, a stream that shimmered like scattered coins. She'd come here broken, a girl sold as a child, her name her only shield, until Tuan had found her, his voice trembling with truth. "You're my sister," he'd said, and their mother had wept, her hands tracing the birthmark on Diep's neck, a guide to a family she'd clung to. They'd sat in a shack, weaving baskets by lamplight, the air thick with rice and forgiveness. "You're home," her mother had said, her cough a soft scar, and Diep had believed it, a spark against the dark she'd wandered. Her mother's hands had taught her to weave, each strand a lesson in patience, a map of love she'd carried through the years. She'd been a child then, barely 5, when an uncle had sold her, his coins heavy with betrayal. She'd lived with strangers, her name a secret, until she'd fled, a girl of 12, her heart a drumbeat against fear. Tuan had found her in a market, his eyes wide with recognition, and brought her to their mother, her cough already a shadow. "You're mine," she'd said, and Diep had wept, her hands learning rice, her heart learning home. But home was a lie, Tuan had confessed, his voice cracking in the cafe. "She's not your mother," he'd said. "My sister died 20 years ago." He'd lied to spare their mother's heart, to give her hope before the cancer took her. But his truth had torn Diep's world apart. Tuan's burdens had scarred him, his hands once empty, now steadier with work, but his voice carried guilt, his eyes heavy with the pain he'd caused. He'd hidden the truth, letting Diep believe she was family, because their mother's wish was to see her daughter again. "I couldn't tell her," he'd said, and Diep had listened, her tea cold, her heart colder, the cafe's hum a distant roar. She'd wanted to scream, to run, but James had found her, his hand warm against hers, his voice a tether, "Let's go home." He'd known, Tuan had told him first, and he'd urged Tuan to choose the right time, to soften the blow, but time had betrayed them all, and now Diep stood, her heart awound, her love for a mother who wasn't hers a flame that flickered but didn't die. The stream glittered now, its waters catching the noon sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Diep knelt beside it, her fingers trailing in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. She'd met James here, his truck mired in Indian, her laughter shy as she helped him push. "I'm no city man," he'd said, his eyes warm as the soil, and she'd believed him, her heart opening before she knew his wealth. They'd worked the fields together, planting melons, dreaming of a farm where love grew deeper than roots. "This is ours," he'd told her, his voice steady as the hills, and she'd seen a house, a garden, a life woven from their hands. But his father had doubted her, his voice sharp with warnings, "She's not enough," and now her own past mocked her, a girl with no family, no name, only love to hold her still. Her past was a shadow woven into her steps. She'd been married once, a girl of 16, to a man who saw her as less, his hands heavy, his voice sharp. She'd fled, her name her only map, and built a life, a shack, a garden, a mother she'd thought was hers. James had seen her, not as broken but as whole, and she'd dared to dream with him, to plant more than crops, to grow a future. But her mother's cough, Tuan's lie, had pulled her back, and the truth, "She's not yours," had cut deeper than any blade. She'd sat by her mother's bed, her hand soft against hers, promising to stay, to love, even as her heart bled, knowing the woman who called her daughter wasn't bound by blood. James had come to the fields, his boots muddy, his hands steady on a tractor that roared under his touch. The F-25 rice project was his dream, a new strain to fight pests, to lift farmers from hunger, and he'd trusted Tuan to lead it, to fix the machines that broke under floodwater. 3 today, Tuan had said, his voice tired but firm, and James had nodded, his eyes on the fields, their green a promise of change. The workers were few, scattered by Tet's call, but James had stayed, his hands guiding the plow, his voice calm with purpose. This is for them, he'd said, meaning the farmers, the village, the life he wanted with her, and she'd watched, her heart torn between pride and pain, knowing his love was her anchor, her shield. The shack glowed now, its roof patched, its yard alive with the cluck of chickens and ducks James had sent. Diep knelt by their pen, her hands steady as she built a coop, Hockey at her heels, his warmth a quiet balm. The cherry tomatoes she planted, James's gift, stood green and firm, their harvest weeks away, a mirror of the hope she clung to. She'd visited her mother yesterday, her bed small in the hospital's hum, her cough softer but stubborn. "You're here," she'd said, her hand weak but warm, and Diep had nodded, her throat tight, promising to stay to love even as Tuan's words, "She's not yours," echoed in her mind. "Get well," she'd whispered, and her mother had smiled, not knowing the truth, her love a spark Diep couldn't let die. Tuan had worked late, his hands black with grease, fixing machines for the F-25 fields. "It's good," he'd said, meaning the rice, its seedlings strong, its yield a hope for farmers who doubted. James had listened, his eyes crinkling, his voice firm with trust. "You'll lead this," he'd said, and Tuan had nodded, his guilt heavy but his purpose clear. He'd spoken of their mother, her surgery a success, her strength returning, and James had smiled, his hand on Tuan's shoulder. "Health first," he'd said, and Diep had heard it, her gratitude deep as the earth, knowing her mother, hers still hers, lived because of James, because of love. The village carried on, its rhythm a gentle pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into the dusk, the stream's murmur a constant hymn. Diep wandered to the fields, their green a promise of Tet, of fortune she wanted to hold. The machines hummed now, their faults mended, and James had shown Tuan how to steer, his hands patient, his voice a guide. "Like this," he'd said, and Tuan had laughed, the tractors roar a song of progress. Diep had watched, her basket heavy with feed, her heart heavier with truth. She'd thought of her grandmother, gone these many years, her stories of rivers that carried dreams, of stars that lit the way. "The heart knows," she'd said, and Diep had carried it, a spark against the years she'd been nothing. A girl sold, a wife escaped, a daughter who wasn't. James had found her in the cafe, her tears hot, her voice lost. "Let's go home," he'd said, and she'd followed, her hand in his, the village quiet around them, the hills bearing witness to their trust. He'd spoken of love, of bonds beyond blood, his voice steady as the earth. "She's your mother," he'd said, meaning her heart, her choice, and she'd nodded, her pain raw but softening, his words a balm to her wound. He'd seen her mother's love, Tuan's care, and known it was enough, more than enough. "You're not alone," he'd said, and she'd clung to it, a vow that held her still, a promise that love could heal what truth had broken. The chickens clucked now, their feathers bright in the dusk, and Diep scattered feed, her hands steady, her heart less so. James had sent them, a gift to ease her days, and she'd built their coop, her fingers sure, her mind less certain. The F-25 rice grew, its seedlings a hope for the village, and Tuan worked, his hands mending what broke, his heart mending what he'd torn. Their mother lay stronger, her cough fading, her love for Diep a thread that held, blood or not. James had spoken of the future, of fields heavy with grain, of a farm they'd build together. "We'll do this," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her hands ready, her heart full but fragile. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. She thought of James, his laughter, his hands on the plow, his voice a shield against her pain. He'd spoken of rice, of farmers free from hunger, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her mother's strength was new, a thread that could snap, and Tuan's guilt, though fading, was a weight that pressed them all. The truth, "She's not yours," was a wound she carried, its edges softening but sharp, and the love she gave to a mother who wasn't, was a choice she made each day. She thought of the hospital, her mother's hand in hers, the promise she'd made, "I'll stay." James had stood beside her, his presence a quiet strength, and Tuan had watched, his eyes wet with guilt, his voice soft with hope. "She's better," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart racing, her hands still from stroking her mother's hair. "You're mine," her mother had said, and Diepp had believed it, wanted to believe it, even as the truth cut deep. James had spoken of love, of bonds that held beyond blood, and she'd listened, her pain raw but easing, his words a bridge to a future she couldn't see. The fields had hummed, the machines alive, the rice a promise of change. James had guided Tuan, his hand steady, his voice a guide, and Diepp had watched, her basket heavy, her heart heavier. She'd fed the chickens, built their coop, and thought of her mother, her love a spark she wouldn't let die. James had stayed, his boots by the door, his voice low with plans. "You're enough," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart trembling, her eyes on the fields, their green a hope she clung to. The truth was a wound, but his love was a balm, and she wanted to trust it, to believe it could heal. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would her mother heal or fade like the dusk? Would Tuan stand tall or falter under guilt? Would James with his fields and dreams stay hers, or would pain, hers the world's, pull them apart? She thought of the rice, the seedlings strong, the love that held her mother close, and James's voice, "You're not alone," a vow that warmed her shack. Would their love heal, a seed in Tet's glow, or wither under truths too heavy? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now Diepp stood by the fields, the moon high, the village quiet save for the stream's endless hymn. She thought of James, of his promise, of the love they'd forged in dust and pain. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.